All right. Welcome everyone to the spARO session on navigating the grant landscape. It is my pleasure today to introduce our two speakers, Dr. Ruth Litovsky and Dr. Christopher Geissler. And as a short intro for both of them before we get into the session, Dr. Ruth Litovsky is the professor and past chair in the Department of Communicative Sciences and Disorders at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's now the associate dean for the sciences at the college. Dr. Litovsky's research has been funded by NIH and NIDCD since she was a postdoc in 1991, as well as non-federal organizations and foundations. Her research on hearing, children, and adults includes studies on sound localization, binaural hearing, source separation, speech intelligibility, echo suppression, and how experience impacts perception and auditory development. In recent years, her labs also embarked on studies in individuals with Down syndrome to help understand hearing loss, cognition, language, brain structure. Ruth's lab uses approaches that are multidisciplinary, including psychophysics, modeling, reverse engineering, pupillometry, and eye gaze. And the lab has begun to implement neuroimaging to investigate the neural signatures for auditory processing, including EEG, MRI, and FNIRS. Dr. Litovsky, in addition, was the first woman to receive the silver medal for her research physiological and psychological acoustics from the Acoustical Society of America. She was honored with the Carhart Memorial Lecture of the American Auditory Society, was a Fulbright Senior Fellow, elected Fellow of the Acoustical Society of America, was president of ARO, and is currently the editor-in-chief of the journal Ear and Hearing. Ruth is passionate about mentoring and service to her community, and is delighted to be here, especially as a very wonderful short notice addition to this session. Our other speaker is Dr. Christopher Geissler. He's the Director of Program and Research Support at the Hearing Health Foundation, where he manages the foundation's grant-making programs. He completed his PhD at Cambridge University and held postdoctoral positions in Mainz, Germany, and Calgary, Canada. Dr. Geissler is not a scientist by training. He's an historian, but has become well-versed in the particularities of biomedical research since joining the Hearing Health Foundation in 2019. Chris coordinates the work of the HHF's scientific governing bodies and its reviewer committees for the Emerging Research Grants program. As both speakers give their insights on the grant process, I invite you to use the Zoom chat to post any questions you might have. And if you wish to ask a question anonymously, you can send me a direct question or a direct message. Once the floor is open, you are also welcome to unmute and ask questions to our speakers directly. But without further ado, my pleasure to have Dr. Litovsky and Dr. Geissler with us today.
Thank you so much, George. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with our community today. And I know this is short notice. Normally, you would have the very expert input and opinion of NIDCD staff, but I'll do my best to provide some information based on my experience, and definitely happy to answer questions. What I'm going to do is share my screen. I prepared a few slides, which I know that with the recording, people can go back and also look at some of those slides. So what I wanted to do is to share with you just my thoughts about successful pathways to getting your research funded. And I wanted to start by having folks think about what stage of career are you at, because that will help you think through whether you're going to submit a mentored or a sponsored award, So for example, if you're a graduate student and you have to consider your US residency or citizenship status, because some of the mentored awards require a certain type of residency, or a postdoctoral fellow, and of course, research scientists who are advancing through their career, staff scientists or research professors, also can either submit a mentored sponsored award, or they could start to apply for the early stage investigator awards. And then that would include also the assistant professor. Once folks have gotten tenure at an institution, they're in a more advanced or mid-career stage and typically would opt for something like the RO1, but other mechanisms that include some mentoring and career transitions are relevant as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to kind of plan ahead and to think about and investigate what are the mechanisms that you're eligible to apply for, so you're not wasting your time. Um, there are, of course, the federal funds, which I mentioned, and the non-federal funds, such as HHF, that Chris will talk about, and some international consortia. Potentially, you may also be eligible for sponsorship from industry, but typically that would be through the PI's lab rather than a direct agreement with a student or a postdoc. Another part of planning ahead is, I think the most important part is to organize your ideas. And I often encourage people to have a 5-year plan in mind, even if you're in graduate school or a postdoc. Think about where you want to land in 2 years, 5 years time. So you're building blocks of your research career, and you're scaffolding your career with what might I do in step one, and what kind of the next step might look like. What skills might I want to acquire now, and what would be the next phase in my career? Ask yourself what methods you want to learn, what models you want to explore, and what tools are critical to your success. And ask yourself, who are the scientists that can train you in these areas? And I say that because when I was a graduate student, I studied perception, but I knew that for my postdoc, I wanted to study neurophysiology, neuroscience. And then as soon as I got to my postdoc, I realized that as I also include future studies with humans, I needed to gain more tools and skills that I obtained later on. So I was always kind of thinking a few years ahead to not only what am I learning now, but what's the next phase going to look like. So another part of planning ahead is look into which labs that you're interested in learning that you might want to learn more tools from next, and reach out and form connections with those folks. Think about also what can you bring to a research group in terms of what expertise you have, what tools you have under your belt or knowledge or experience, and talk with the PI about that, because that creates synergy, and that's how they get excited about recruiting you as well. And and understand how your ideas are innovative. I think being innovative and unique is really important because it helps you write grants in a way that make it clear what you're bringing to the field that is novel and interesting. Think about if you're interested in basic science, in translational science, in clinical work, and maybe do some of those early on, and then think about other phases later on. So, getting some basic science early on in your career might be a great move, and then moving into the translational and clinical could be the next phases. But some folks do these in different orders. Um, I strongly recommend that planning ahead with each grant proposal means at least a year of planning. So, for example, if you're a graduate student, ask yourself, how can your mentor or advisor support your application? Do you need additional mentors? For example, if your advisor is relatively junior, or if the methods require expertise that they don't have, they can still be your mentor, but bring on co-mentors. Um, Ask yourself who would be good co-sponsors for your application. Um, if you're a postdoctoral fellow, those same questions apply as well. If you're a medical resident or any time during your training, the same questions apply. But now you also need to think about and discuss with potential mentors how you might apply for a postdoc fellowship, maybe even prior to going to the lab. So while you're still in graduate school, you might talk to them about starting to write an individual fellowship like an F-32. You could also do the same thing with what they call the kangaroo grant, the K99R00, and that's especially useful potentially for a second postdoc because the K99 is only a couple of years and then it purchases you to then move on to a faculty position with the R00. And there are other mentored mechanisms. Some are more geared to clinician scientists that we can also look at as well. I want to encourage you to get to know your research areas, institutes. In hearing science, there are a number of institutes that rise to the top. Of course, NIDCD, National Institute for Deafness and Communication Disorders, is the top one. But we also have a lot of grants on hearing science and related fields funded by the NIA, the National Institute on Aging. The NICHD also funds research related to auditory science, and of course, the NINDS as well. And there are others if you look through Reporter. And I encourage you to become familiar with the NIH Reporter for ideas about topics that are funded by these institutes and to lean into understanding what types of grants are funded. So I have the links provided here as well. And also there's some really great information as you go into the webpage on training awards. And they do a nice job of showing you eligibility by education level. And so if you go to the website and you click on these links, it will show you at the graduate level, postdoc, new and junior investigator, established, and sort of what are the different types of mechanisms that you can apply for, including the LRP, the Loan Repayment Program, administrative supplements as well. What about developing your application? So I encourage you to, first of all, look at the instructions and understand all the components of the application because there are many. The science, like in a award, is very short. It's 6 pages, or an R21, but the application is dozens of pages long because there's so many other things that go into it. And understand the level of training and mentoring and sponsorship that is required. So work in advance of the deadline to get input, to get feedback on every piece of the application. And be sure when you write it that your ideas are clear, that they're easy to follow, that you think folks are going to be really compelled by your ideas, and that they're unique. There is a lot of discussion about how much of an application needs to be hypothesis driven. Can it be descriptive? That's something to really talk with area experts about. But I definitely encourage you to have meticulous detail, have it be flawless, no errors, make sure it's easy to read and to follow. There's also a lot of discussion, and we can get into that in terms of how much preliminary data is needed. For example, the instructions say that some grants, like an R21, don't really need preliminary data. But then, having been on review panels, I see that reviewers often want to see some preliminary data because they want you to demonstrate feasibility. They want you to demonstrate that you can do these experiments. And make sure that the story flows really well. So the text that you write and the figures have to be connected. They have to talk to each other and tell the story in a cohesive manner. It's important that wherever institution you're at, there's very clear support. So be sure that the PI, the department, the institution are on board with providing support and writing those letters of support. Get letters for any additional funding you might need. Like if you're doing human research, there's a lab, they're going to help you with paying for subjects or making sure you have space and other resources. And again, depending on your career stage, the grant may be reviewed with lower scores for the environment if this is not very clearly articulated, because it's hard to justify providing a grant if we're not sure if the sorry, if the government is not sure that there's institutional support. Um, I think it's really important that if a grant receives reviews, even if the reviews are glowing, read them carefully because the feedback might still be really helpful in terms of thinking about your experiment. But if the grant is not funded, then it's especially important to read the summary statement and review it with your NIH program officer. If the grant was discussed, they will have listened to the discussion and they will have taken notes. So get them to provide you input and ask them to give you their honest opinion about the merit of the research and whether they really believe that you should come back in with a proposal on this same topic. I think it's really humbling to get feedback. At all stages of our career, we get critical feedback. I think it's really humbling to think about what others have to say about our research, and we have to be open to input, to the ideas that are generated during the review, and to the suggestions and to the critiques, and not to be defensive, but to think really carefully about the points that they are making. And then to discuss the feedback with colleagues, with collaborators, with mentors, and be ready, if necessary, to pivot to new directions. And one other really important part of getting funded is how you stay funded, because you get the first grant and then you want to keep going. So how do you advance through the different career stages? I think it's important to publish your research, to present at conferences, for your research to be known, stay connected and understand what else is going on in the field, continue to develop ideas and build out that 5-year plan that I mentioned earlier. Also, be careful when you're putting out your grant not to overpromise and then feel like you underdelivered and didn't meet the goals of the grant. And reviewers know, well, they have a sense of whether the goals can be accomplished. So it's better to try to be realistic. And then think about who you are, what you want others to know about who you are in the field. So, what do you want to be known for? The person who did X, the person who's thinking about X or discovering X. So that's kind of fun to try to think about how to invent yourself and what is your imagination about who you want to be thought of as a scientist. So after Chris tells us about HHF, I think we can take some questions. And I think what I'll do is stop sharing here. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Ruth. That was an incredibly comprehensive and useful presentation. I feel like that PowerPoint should be the little red book that everyone should get. And I think there was specific, in a lot of respects, to applying for NIH and similar awards. I would say 90+% of what Ruth said is completely relevant to applying for awards from Hearing Health Foundation or other smaller funders like the American Hearing Research Foundation or the American Otological Society, etc. I think HHF particularly fits into the middle of that first diagram that Ruth showed of the career stages of, mentoring, supported grants, and then early stage investigator. HHF is targeting the postdoctoral scholars and assistant professors, especially. We also have awards for more senior investigators as well. But I think in that level of grant application is where you really can get a lot of good practice for writing your NIH applications later on. And I would say HHF particularly, and other funders, I'm going to invoke the AHRF and others as well. I think most of us have, as part of the program's mission, so for us, the Emerging Research Grants Program, which is our open application program, is to provide seed funding to especially early career researchers to get the preliminary data, to assemble the necessary experience, to then be well positioned to go on to successfully compete for major federal awards or other major funding from private foundations like the Allen Institute, etc. So I think HHF and others are key component in there that allows you to get that preliminary data that Ruth was talking about that are going to be useful and really necessary for a lot of those NIH and other major awards. And also to test out your ideas and gain experience in the grant writing. I did particularly like Ruth's comments about paying attention to the entirety of the application. I think that was one key sort of aspect of feedback that I think across the board I can share with applicants is you spend a lot of time, understandably and justifiably, working on your research proposal, which can be of different lengths depending on what you're doing, your experimental plan, laying out your milestones. But there is the rest of the application in addition, and the reviewers are looking at that. And in a way, the rest of the application, aside from your research proposal itself, an experimental plan, that's where the reviewers and any sort of governing bodies are really going to determine how well your proposal fits with the overall mission of that funding scheme. So it's really important to utilize the rest of the application, to pay attention to it, and to treat it as a key component of your pitch, essentially, to the funder. And I would say that's one of the key things I would say is understanding the mission of the funding scheme. So as I said, HHF and other smaller funders are looking to allow investigators to assemble that preliminary data to then go on. So this ties in with what Ruth was talking about, having a 5-year plan, which is a fantastic way to organize how you think about your career. It has to have some sort of timescape beyond your immediate current stage. But that has to come across in the application to funders like HHF. We want to fund people for whom there is a clear pathway. There's a clear sense of what it is they're trying to go on to do next, not only what they're proposing to us, but what comes after that, which will be described in a different level of detail, of course, but it has to be evident. And a lot of that will come across in the application outside of your research proposal itself. And it's really key to make sure that the reviewers have a sense of that, because we talk about it in a way as an investment in early stage investigators. And you want to invest in something that's going to go on to be successful. So as exciting as the project itself may be, and that's important too, right? Your proposal has to be innovative, exciting, and significant, but it also we have to sense that it's going to go on and contribute and continue to contribute to the research you're going to do in the field. So I think having that 5-year plan, if you can think about that in the way that Ruth was talking about, if you haven't already, that really will help you frame and focus how you think about how is this piece going to fit into that, and be able to better convey that in a pretty clear and concise way in applications to funders like HHF. I took notes while Ruth was talking because I thought she's hitting all of the major points that I think is important for applying to an organization like Hearing Health Foundation. The comment about overpromising and feasibility is super important too. I think one of the things that I hear a lot in the review sessions is, ambition is very good and admirable and necessary, but there is a fine line. And I think part of what is really necessary too, and this just goes to general grant writing skills, is particularly at the earlier stages of making sure that you are utilizing your senior colleagues as much as possible, your mentors, your supervisor. They're oversubscribed and have limited time, but any time you can get from them to help you assess the application, your research proposal, making sure that you're staying within the conventions that the reviewers are going to expect, and that your proposal is realistic, because again, they will have sat on these review committees themselves and will know exactly the types of comments that will be raised if something seems like it's just overpromising, it's just not feasible in a 2-year grant to achieve what you want. And the proposal is assessed on its own merit. So if it's feasible and it's significant and it's innovative, then that's good enough. You don't need to promise 6 aims that can't possibly be completed in 2 years if your first 4 are really worthy on their own. And the final comment I wanted to say too is this, based off of Ruth's comments about letters of support, that it is really important to get support from the institution, from your lab, from the department, etc. And sometimes those letters of support, you should feel free and encouraged to use them strategically, that they might not all be necessary. They might not all be sort of asked for, but there will always be an opportunity to provide them. And if it can help ensure that the reviewers or the funding organization is convinced that you have the resources and the support that you need to achieve the work, then you stop us from having to even ask whether that's a concern. So think strategically about how you might use those sorts of things, even if it's not required as part of the application. So I think that would be my final comment to all of those components that I think Ruth talked about. It really is about strategically utilizing what you have and conveying the message that you want to convey to the funding organization, and that the funding organization understands as fitting within its remit and its mission. And I'll stop there because I think it would be great to hear questions from the moderators and the attendees.
These are both fantastic perspectives for both of you. I feel like already some of my pre-planned questions have already been addressed extremely well. And as those of the audience are collecting their thoughts, maybe posting in Zoom chat, I like this idea. Well, I'm intrigued by this idea of overpromising and being too ambitious at the grants. And have either of you come across sort of prompts or topics that have had difficulty because there are certain methodologies that seem to be added as an afterthought because they think it will be appealing, but it actually shows that they're just trying to check a box of saying, yes, we will do MRI, or yes, we will do electron microscopy, when it's not really serving the proposal.
Yeah. As a reviewer, both of, I served on a panel for 4 years that reviewed a lot of the fellowships, in the early career. And then I just came off of a 4-year panel of OD, which is the R01, grant mechanism. So I think there are some strategic errors people make. Sometimes they feel like they have to, like you said, tick every box, don't leave any stone unturned, make sure people know that you're thinking about this, you're going to explore all of this. But, as a reviewer, if you read throughout all the experiments and try to calculate for the staff that could be on the grant, is this feasible? You realize it's going to be very hard to get even one of these or two of these aims done. So I think it's better to write 2 or 3 like really good, strong aims, but not overpromise, than to show. Otherwise, it looks like you're a bit disorganized and maybe all over the place. And so I think you just want to be. Or I've heard I don't do animal studies, but I've heard people say there's no way they're gonna be able to use that many animals in this time, and it seems wasteful and it's overpromising, and we're not sure what will really come of that. That sort of discussion does come up sometime. Yeah.
I would add
There's
on the same
yeah.
in using supporting documentation to sort of substantiate, because even if you're not adding on a technique or a specific piece of equipment or something because it's trendy, but you really do need to use it. If it's not clear in the rest of your application that you have experience using it or having done it before, so it's not
Right.
evident in your publications or elsewhere, then you should make sure that you have some sort of supporting letter that can substantiate that you have enough experience that you're going to be able to do what you promised to do, or it's from a colleague of yours who has that experience who's going to help you. They should be listed. They should be mentioned somewhere in the application as well. So I think those questions come up in review sessions about if it's a question that you can even do what you promised, not necessarily in time, but that you have the requisite expertise and experience to do that technique, then you're already starting off on the back foot. And I think so that's another way that to use that supporting the supporting letters to make sure that it is clear. And what Ruth said too about animal studies, I think that's one of the question that comes up again and again in reviews, especially for studies that use human subjects or volunteers, that if you it's hard to get volunteers for studies at universities. If you have a way that you already know you're going to be able to achieve the numbers you promised because there are people enrolled in a study down the hall with someone else, or they're in the audiology clinic down the hall.
Yeah.
Make sure that the reviewers know that. Otherwise, it just looks like you're promising a lot of volunteers, and we know that if you're starting from zero, it's going to be very hard to find that number of volunteers in the first 6 months, first 9 months, etc. So make sure we know that you have a plan.
Wonderful. We have a question in the chat asking for commentary on the methods and approach section, and also, I guess, the pitfalls where grants might receive lower scores in those sections.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's whether there are comments on methods and approach and what types of things grants don't get a good score for. So first of all, I think that a strong score typically comes from showing in the approach that every idea that appears in the specific aims and then the background and significance is then harnessed in an approach that shows that A, you know what you're doing, B, you're addressing the question that you're proposing to address, and C, that you have demonstrated feasibility. And sometimes, even if all those things work out really well, if there are sort of multiple layers of too many methods that have been added because you think they're adding enrichment, but it turns out that they're actually sort of kind of detracting from the main point of the grant, that can then reduce the score because it can go up because some things look really good, but then the score can go down because there's all this extra stuff and it's not clear if then it becomes a grantsmanship issue, and there's a sort of, there are comments that have to do with if these ideas weren't also in there because there's too many approaches and we're not sure how they're all going to fit in, and how are the statistics going to be handled and what's the statistical power. So this is what, and I say this because my own grants have received those sort of, feedback, is just to be very clear on what's the purpose of each experiment, what goal, and how you're going to get it done.
I think I have nothing to add. I think that was a very detailed response about that section.
We have another question from Kelsey about, as a new assistant professor, what's a good strategy for selecting grants to apply for in the beginning? Is it a good idea to prioritize multiple smaller foundation or early investigator grants, or focus on securing a larger NIH level RO?
Kelsey, if I can out you and say that I'm pretty sure you got a K99 R00, right? And I say that because I think you announced it at a GRC meeting. Or like you found out about it then. And I say that because having gotten a K99 R00, you are ready for the R01, right? But if you hadn't gotten funded by NIH with one of these mechanisms, like an R21 or an R01, sorry, an R21 or an K99, then I would say go more for the R21, also go for HHF. So I think you sort of have to scaffold a little bit. It's unusual to come in for an R01 unless you've had some prior funding, an R03 in some institutes, to show that you're kind of a proven, investigator who has, received funding and used it responsibly. So I would say you are ready for the R01, maybe. I mean, but you I think probably want to show what you've done in the previous few years of funding and how you've harnessed those so that they naturally lead to the R01. So I think tying in what you've done to the next phase and talking about that is really important.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's what my intuition was, but you know, I see a lot of people where they apply for a ton of early investigator awards, and so I'm trying to balance whether that's valuable to do that, but then at the same time, that's kind of taking time away from, you know, getting my lab set up and getting the data needed for an R01.
And remember, it might take a couple 2, 3 tries, you know, so it's good to think ahead. When am I going to need funding and how many cycles, you know, so kind of preparing for the worst and hoping for the best.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I would say too, the strategizing. So a foundation like HHF will not know if you try for a K99 and don't get one, for example, HHF or the other smaller foundations won't know that. It's not a strike against you. So to go for an NIH award and then, you know, if you're not one of the ones chosen that year to go for HHF or AHRF, why not? Because then the more that you, again, funders like to see people who have been funded as well. There's an element of unfairness to it, but that is just the reality. And the second part of that too is to make sure that the outputs from those earlier awards are clear. So that's one thing that comes up in our review as well. People who have had prior awards, whether it's an NIH award or from another smaller foundation, the PI's productivity has to be evident too. So you might also, in part of planning, think about whether if publications are in the pipeline, but they're not quite out yet by the time that an application is due, it might, if you can, then be worth waiting until that evidence is available for the organization and the reviewers to know about it. I think the other just very minor sort of bureaucratic element too to think about is that for smaller funders like HHF and for others as well, the eligibility requirements for certain early stage investigator awards can be quite specific. So for example, the general awards that we have for ESIs can be on any topic, but if the PI has had a K99, they can't apply. Or if you have over $100,000 currently in direct costs outside funding, you can't apply for that award. You're still welcome to apply for topic-specific awards that we offer in, say, Meniere's disease or hyperacusis, but if your work isn't on that topic, it's not going to help you. So I think that might be another benefit too of having that 5-year plan and thinking ahead, as Ruth advised, knowing if you will be able to apply to HHF or another smaller foundation 1 or 2 years down the line might help you strategize when you're going to go for which.
Well, I have a question that might be a little more suited for Ruth, but of course you're both welcome to answer. Because in addition to obviously writing and receiving grants and funding yourself, there's also the mentoring aspect of fellowships for trainees. And have you experienced or have you personally seen any kind of change over time in the mentoring of the grant writing process, or how institutions are sort of talking to their trainees and incoming PhD students about that fellowship application process?
Well, I can speak for sure about my own institution and say that PhD students in my department are required to take a grant writing course. And in fact, the timing of that course is set up so that they take it after they've done their preliminary exams when they are ready to write a grant. And ideally they write like their F31, or if they have an AUD degree, it would be an F32. Postdoctoral fellows can sometimes be allowed in that class as well, and then they can write a grant as well, and different mechanisms are addressed in that class. So and I think a lot of institutions have mandatory grant writing workshops and seminars, and that's definitely not available when I was a student or a postdoc. But I think that because the mentoring component is both viewed as critical to the success of the grant and critical to the success of the trainees' research and to their ability to ask really good questions, to get input and feedback, and to do well. I think all of that depends on the relationship with the mentors. So it's not just that it's advisable or administratively required, it's highly recommended. And I think a lot of institutions are doing that.
I have a question regarding timeline about early stage investigator. Like, up to how is there any time limit? Like within like some grants or awards are like within 10 years of your PhD, you will be considered early stage, and after that, you are no more early stage investigator, particularly for foundational grants.
Chris?
Yes, certainly for HHF, but that's also the NIH definition, which we sort of defer to, that within 10 years of the PhD or your medical residency, if you're an MD or MD PhD, you would no longer be eligible for those early stage investigator awards. So that's also something to consider in your 5-year plan.
All right, thank you.
One thing I didn't say that I think is important is ask people that you know if they're willing to share copies of their successful proposals. And one thing we do in our grant writing course at my institution is we gather copies of successful proposals from people who are willing to share them. And we show them to folks in the class, and we suggest that they think about the templates that are used as to how people have built their argument. And I think it's really helpful. When I was writing my first R01, which before the K99 existed, there was the K29. It was called a first award, and I converted that to an R01. But I asked some friends who had been successful at getting an R01 to show me their grants, and it was very helpful to just think about how they built out their, significance and background, and then leaned into the methods. And there's some foreshadowing. So there's a lot of strategizing in how you prepare your reader to know what's coming next, and how you use your specific aims as a skeleton for how you then build out your argument throughout the grant. So seeing a successful proposal could really be very eye-opening.
Yeah, that sounds really helpful, and we can plan accordingly, like if we are following the right template or not, particularly for people who are like beginners. And some, well, like when I started writing for one of my grant, so I didn't even know like how to prepare the budget and what are the things that need to go in direct cost versus indirect cost, because we at my institute, we don't have any like grant writing workshop or anything like that. So
adding on to that, one thing I know with the format of the NIH grants is that there are a lot of sections, but what comes with those sections, especially when reading through previously funded grants, are all of the ways in which that applicant is tapping into their institution and their facilities and resources, where you might find out like, oh, they're making use of this core facility or this collaborator lab that would actually be fantastic for my own project. I should go to the cellular imaging core facility or the virology one. And so that can also be very helpful with just reading previously funded grants, especially at your own institution, if those are available as part of a class.
I'm going to answer Ahmed's question in a second, but I have one more thing to add, which is, as a mentor of a sponsored award like an F31 or an F32 or a K99, I've also learned by reading successful proposals. For example, if I read the training section, I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. I should really think about how to embed this idea into my training protocol with with my mentee and to put that into the application. So I think sharing ideas across investigators is really helpful as well because we learn from each other. We're not all expert or perfect at what we're doing, and I think innovating with each other is really important also. Well, Ahmed, you're asking such an important question. Are there tips for getting better at coming up with new innovative ideas? That's sort of the, $20 million question, right? So I would say one thing you want to do is um, start by following your gut. Like what does your gut tell you is missing? That that some work has been done, but where is there a gap? So think about where is there a gap that you're really interested in, right? That's the first step. But the second step is how to turn that into a really great question and a hypothesis-driven question that you can explore and investigate. And one way to sharpen a new innovative idea is to prepare a set of specific aims and to run them by other people and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing. What do you think? How exciting is this? And often people will give you really critical feedback that help you sharpen those ideas and say, well, but if you look in the literature, this has already kind of been done, except in that way. So kind of having folks give you feedback and input on your ideas is going to be really important. But I think you have to be very excited about your own idea and know that this is work that you want to do, and then get a lot of feedback and a lot of sharpness from other experts.
I would add one, in addition to that, one of the lessons that I would bring from our HHS other funding program, the Hearing Restoration Project, which is a consortium that's been around since 2011, trying to regenerate inner ear hair cells. One of the great lessons there too is to avoid siloization as much as you can. I think you should be talking to colleagues, but outside of your own field too, as much as possible, because sometimes we're too in the weeds on what it is we're doing. And sometimes there's really innovative, or sometimes the questions that spark innovative ideas for you are coming from people in related fields or completely unrelated fields who ask something that seems obvious to them, but wouldn't seem obvious to you. And that can then be taken on and then what Ruth is saying, put together a set of aims and bounce it off people who do have expertise within your silo to make sure that it makes sense. But I think avoid becoming too siloized within your own department, within your own subfield is important as well.
And actually building off of Chris's comment, bringing in ideas from other fields could be fantastic. And there's some really beautiful examples of where ideas in, for example, psychology and cognitive science have infiltrated the auditory work in very innovative ways. A good demo. Let's see. Funding review cycles are long, spanning many months. Okay. That's a good question. I don't think that, for example, HHF would know if you've also submitted an R21 or vice versa. But if they're both reviewed favorably and it looks like you're going to get both of them, then you have to let each of the agencies know. And then one of the agencies might say, you need to pull it out because you can't double dip. But I know people who've submitted similar ideas to, say, NIH and NSF, for example. And I think you're right, the funding cycles are really long, and so you're waiting to hear back. And so then some folks have also got kind of two different ideas going. So they'll submit a grant through one cycle, and then while they're waiting to hear back, submit a different grant through the next cycle. And then they kind of are going back and forth between the cycles and the different ideas until at least one hopefully is funded.
I would add what Ruth said is exactly Ruth has worked with HHF too, so she knows process works on our end. It's exactly true. I would say at HHF, for example, we do ask if you have submitted awards to other agencies or if you plan to in the near future. And I encourage everyone to be honest about that. It does not negatively affect the review. As Ruth said, it's sort of, if it comes up that you're successful in both, then we deal with it then, but we're not going to penalize you because you're ambitious and you've applied to other agencies as well. So it's certainly not a problem.
So how can researchers in communication sciences and this sort of effectively align their grant proposals with the evolving funding priorities to enhance impact? Okay, to Ranya's question. Well, that's a great question. It's sometimes hard to know exactly how the evolving funding priorities are shifting, and it feels sometimes a little bit like a moving target. On the other hand, priorities don't, I haven't seen priorities just kind of like take a leap and a jump completely away from what has been happening in recent years. So I think while there is potentially, pivoting towards certain directions, you can look to see what has been funded in the last year or two by specific agencies and know that those are still areas of priority. But I would also urge you very strongly to speak to program officers and ask them, just say, this is what I'm really excited about. Is this still an area of priority for the Institute? And would you recommend that this is an area that I pursue? And their job is to help you know if this is a bygone or if it's still an area that the Institute is willing to fund. But listen carefully to their words of wisdom, because sometimes you have to read between the lines and they might say, sure, that's an area that would be funded by our Institute. And what they mean is, yeah, but there aren't that many, but they're not going to tell you that. On the other hand, they might be more enthusiastic about another idea and say, that's a real up and coming field. I'm seeing more and more grants funded by, in this area. This is something you should really think about. So listen carefully to their words of wisdom and follow up with more direct questions. It's their job to help you know what the priorities are.
I also imagine there's a certain conference coming up at the end of this month where, based on the presentations and the topics that people are excited about, that is what's percolating in the field. And the recent questions that ARO is thinking about is very much aligned with a lot of those
Sure.
people are the study sections and the peers and collaborators for our field.
Yeah.
We have just about 5 minutes or so left in this session, so if you still have a burning question, please be sure to post it in the chat or unmute and ask so that we can both respect the speakers' times, but also get all of these excellent and amazing insights that they've both been offering.
I guess while people are thinking if there's another question, I'll say that I know people are nervous these days because of all the news that's coming out from the federal government, and the last week was especially challenging with some, changes and issuing of executive orders and then rescinding and messages that are going out by leadership at most campuses around the United States about funding and federal funding and how to use funding moving forward. And I want to say that, I'm sorry for our younger generation of scientists that you are facing this. I know these are challenging times. My optimist, if I wear my optimism hat, says, research will continue. We will learn more about, how the institutes will function and whether there are, any changes, and we will learn to figure things out as we move forward. But I know people are nervous and this is a rough time. And I see a question. I'm in an early stage. I don't have a green card. Not eligible. Oh, okay. You're welcome.
I do know there are plenty, in the past, we've sometimes had a grant spARO session that's involved one of our international ARO members that are parts of different funding institutions. So there's a lot of great insight among the ARO memberships and members at large about those opportunities, both in Europe and in Asia and across the world for international grant opportunities.
And if you're an international researcher in a lab, the PI might be interested in working with you on a grant proposal, you know, and they might end up being the PI, but you're sort of a co-investigator. You know, there might be ways for you to be heavily involved in a grant proposal that will support your research, you know, moving forward. So there are quite a few ways to think about that. So please speak with PIs and speak with folks, you know, who are seasoned and experienced and get their input. And if you're coming to ARO or the American Auditory Society or other upcoming conferences, you know, I know that people who are seasoned will be happy to speak with our younger generation and give as much input and advice as we're able to.
I would definitely just underline that too, that we appreciate it when people approach us. I speak on behalf of other funders as well, that when you have questions, you should approach us in person at ARO or via email or phones. That's why we're there. I think the program officers at the NIH that Ruth was talking about are much more overtly supposed to engage with you as part of their job description, but that's what I do and what my colleagues at other organizations do. So please, if you have these sorts of questions, just ask us. That's why we're here.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. Thank you to everyone for their questions they input. We have 2 spARO sessions left, both of them occurring on Thursday for careers in academia and careers in industry. But this has been the session on navigating the grant landscape. And just once again, thank you both to Dr. Litovsky and Dr. Geissler for a fantastic session.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
There.
Care, everyone.